All right, let's get started. What we're doing here is a strategic analysis of the Vizcaya campaign. We're going to examine the operational posture and, more importantly, the critical vulnerabilities of the Basque forces, all from a purely military standpoint.
It's important to note that this entire analysis is grounded in the meticulous research from the Batallas Guerra Civil project, spearheaded by Colonel F.J. Victor Rodrigo. That's our foundation for a rigorous, fact-based assessment.
Okay, here's how we're going to break this down. We'll start with the strategic situation, then look at their force organization, the terrain and assets, key internal command factors, and finally, we'll wrap it up with our conclusions.
So, first up, the strategic situation. Look, to understand this campaign at all, you have to grasp just how isolated it was. Vizcaya wasn't just a battlefield. For all intents and purposes, it was an island.
This map right here tells the whole strategic story in one glance. You see, Vizcaya, along with Santander and Asturias, was part of the Northern Theater, a pocket completely cut off from the main Republican territory. This isolation made any kind of reinforcement or resupply an absolute logistical nightmare. Strategic coordination was practically impossible from day one.
And that brings us to a crucial point. From a doctrinal perspective, for a defense like this to have any chance, you absolutely need three things. First, real unified command. Second, effective outside help. And third, you need major attacks on other fronts to draw off enemy pressure. Vizcaya had none of these. Political divisions, being outgunned at sea, and no coherent grand strategy from the Republic meant they were essentially left to fend for themselves.
So, with that big picture established, let's now drill down into the forces themselves. How were they actually structured, and what were their real capabilities?
Now, on paper, the command structure looked logical enough. The Republic created this Army of the North to supposedly bring the Basque, Santander, and Asturian forces under one banner. But in reality, this structure was mostly a facade. The organization was weak and, as we're about to see, it had no real unified control to speak of.
And this organizational chart, well, it reveals a pretty fundamental flaw in their command structure. If you look closely, the Basque President put a commander in charge of operations who was actually outranked by his own chief of staff. That kind of unorthodox hierarchy is a recipe for friction, and it undermined the chain of command before a single shot was even fired.
This leadership problem wasn't just at the top. It cascaded right down the ranks. Sure, they could mobilize plenty of men, but they had a critical shortage of experienced junior officers and NCOs. You know, the absolute backbone of any army that actually works. The new military academies were a desperate measure, but they were churning out leaders with hardly any training and zero combat experience. You just can't forge an officer corps overnight. It doesn't work.
Okay, let's shift gears and turn to our third area of analysis, the operational environment itself. We're going to assess the situation across the naval, air, and ground domains.
At sea, the situation was frankly dire. The disparity in naval power you see here was just overwhelming. The nationalist fleet enforced a crippling blockade, and yeah, some British warships did run interference for merchant ships, but they couldn't stop the strategic strangulation of the province.
And in the air, the story was just as bad. The Basque forces had just a handful of aircraft. Most were outdated, though they did have a few of the more modern Soviet Chado fighters. The problem was, the mountainous terrain made the early warning systems useless, and on top of that, the Central Republican government completely failed to provide any meaningful air support.
You know, you don't even have to take my word for it. This quote from the Republican Prime Minister himself is absolutely damning. It points to a total breakdown of command and control. The Air Force was basically being run by Soviet advisors who would overrule Spanish commanders. It created this completely dysfunctional system where the men who were nominally in charge had no real authority.
So on the ground, the defensive strategy really came down to two main lines of static fortifications. The first was what they called the exterior line right along the front. The second, which was the final defense for Bilbao itself, was the famous Cinturón de Hierro, the Iron Belt.
But here's the thing about the Iron Belt. This is a straight-up betrayal. It was designed to be this impregnable fortress, but the chief engineer, a man named Alejandro Goicoechea, was a nationalist agent. He deliberately designed gaps, portillos, right into the defenses, and when he defected, he took the blueprints with him, literally handing the nationalists the keys to the city, a catastrophic failure of counterintelligence.
This brings us to our fourth section, the internal factors. Because as we all know, wars aren't just won by hardware and fortifications. The political and moral dimensions are often what decide the outcome. And this slide right here lays out the core irreconcilable conflict, a duality of command. On one hand, the Republic's objective was military integration, a single unified army of the North. But on the other hand, the Basque government's objective was political. They wanted to use the war to build their own separate army for a future state. These two goals were mutually exclusive. It means that true unified command was impossible from the very beginning.
This political divide had devastating effects back on the home front. The naval blockade led to severe food shortages, which absolutely crushed civilian morale. You had deep ideological rifts opening up between the devoutly Catholic Basques and the anti-clerical Republican government. The end result was a total collapse of will, which led to Basque officials secretly trying to negotiate their own separate surrender.
We come now to our final assessment. Let's synthesize all these points into a clear set of conclusions.
So, in summary, the defense of Vizcaya was compromised from the very start by 5 fundamental strategic weaknesses: total geographic isolation, a fatal lack of unified command, overwhelming material inferiority at sea and in the air, crippling internal political conflicts, and finally, treason at the very heart of its primary defensive line. Any one of those factors would be severe. Combined, they were insurmountable.
So, this entire analysis really leads to one single, unavoidable question. When you consider this perfect storm of strategic, operational, and political vulnerabilities, was the defense of Vizcaya ever actually a viable military objective? Or was its fall a strategic inevitability from the moment the campaign began?
For a much more granular look at this campaign, the source material over at batallasguerracivil.es provides extensive detail. This concludes our analysis.